The Fool's Gallery presents Chapter 6, Spider Bite, taken from the journals of Max Landau. Year 148 DD, 37 days into our voyage. The old man looked like a dried-up leaf. Step on him and he'd dissolve into dust. He carried a small, expensive-looking leather case in his left hand and a beautifully lacquered wooden cane in his right. Dance immediately offered the man a chair, and he accepted it with a grateful sigh. Without sparing us a glance, the old man spoke in a voice that sounded like the creak of a loose floorboard. "Show me the items." Carol grabbed my knapsack, stumbling over his feet a little as he did, and delicately placed it on the small table next to the old man. "Here you are, Tinker," he said, his voice gruff but polite. The tinker jerked his head in acknowledgement, and then with long, spindly fingers, he reached into the sack and pulled out each item one by one. First came the rings, to which the tinker gave but a passing glance. Then the necklace, which he dropped to one side with a grunt of disgust. And then came the spider. The tinker slowed and stared at the thing, a toothless smile spreading across his face. "Would you look at that? My, boys. Looks like you've got yourself an amber widow. Rare piece, alchemical in nature. Patented by Dodger Trinkets outside Sado's way, I believe. Made illegal some 20 years ago. Didn't think they made these anymore." "What's it do?" Dance asked, pushing his head into the tinker's personal space. The tinker wrinkled his nose at the intrusion, placed one hand on Dance's shoulder, and softly but sternly moved the big man away from him. "What most spiders do? It bites you. See the teeth?" he said, pointing out the two small needles hanging from the spider's face? Front? I don't know spiders. "You wear it like a bracelet, right? Legs fit around your wrist and the teeth sink in just here." "And what? It kills you?" No. This particular spider contains a powerful anesthetic. The spider's bite reduces your ability to feel. Cry, laugh, love, hurt. It numbs you to everything. Dangerous substance, highly addictive and fatal in large doses. But it should fetch you a fair amount of coin if you find the right junkie. He placed the spider off to one side and pirouetted his hand back into the knapsack. "And this?" The tinker paused, his hand suddenly shaking. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his eyes bulging, as he held up the golden flag we took from the captain's quarters. "It's worth something, isn't it?" Dance said, his greedy eyes alight. "Oh, I should say so. This here's a golden flag, highest honor you can get in the Sadosian Navy. This here will feed you for a month." The brothers jostled each other excitedly. The tinker placed each item carefully back into my knapsack, and then folded his thin fingers across his belly. "And now, on account of price." The brothers' jovial grins fell, and they spent the next few minutes haggling between 5 and 10%. Finally, when they settled on 12, the tinker slowly rose and seemingly spotted us for the first time. "What about them?" he said, poking his cane in my direction. Dance shrugged. "We know the market ain't great for selling flesh, but we thought we'd try our luck." The tinker shook his head. "More trouble than it's worth, my boy. Best you get for a bunch of softies like this is an eighth, and that's hardly worth the light it'll bring you. You get more if you turn them into pig food." I felt my gut clench at these words. I glanced over at Willas, but he was staring at the wall, not even listening to these men discussing our fate. To my horror, the brothers seemed to be finding sense in this course of action. They nodded to one another, and Dance murmured something into Caro's ear while staring directly at me. Then, as if he were the world's most refined gentleman, Dance opened the door for the tinker and they both exited, leaving us alone with Caro. Caro pursed his lips and sighed as if we were his misbehaving kids who had just made a mess. And then he began to speak. "Don't like this part of the job." "No, sir, I do not. Just no good at it, I suppose. Now, I've seen the real pros do it, you know. They cut you 5 different ways in a blink, and you're dead before you know it. Clean as a whistle, I'll tell you. No screaming, no begging, no nothing, just death. It was a pretty sight. Real pros. If I was to be killed, I'd want someone like that to do it. Quick, professional, no mess, no pain. Like I said, real pros. But me, well, I'm an amateur. So, he said, his voice trailing off as he pulled a gigantic, evil-looking knife out of his boot. This might get a little messy. Willas began to scream. He pushed himself up against the wall, tears streaming down his face. Carol pursed his lips. No need to do that. You'll just make it worse. He moved towards Willas, who lashed his arms out ineffectively. Carol shook his head with disapproval and raised his knife high in the air. Then I hit him, tackling him to the ground. We fell in a jumble of limbs and curses. My hands were still bound. His knife went flying. We rolled on the floor, but Carol was bigger, stronger, tougher, and soon he had me pinned, his knee crushing into my throat. I couldn't breathe. My vision was clouding, going black, and then suddenly it wasn't. Carol was standing, glaring at Willas, who was holding the knife in his trembling hands. I almost laughed, but I still couldn't breathe. Who would have thought it would be Willas who would save us? Carol seemed undisturbed by this change of fate, and took a step towards Willas. With a sinking feeling in my gut, Willas stepped away. Carol stepped forward again. Willas stepped backwards. Again, the big man stepped forward, and Willas's back collided with the stone wall. Carol stood over him. I've never seen someone look so small. He was shaking from head to toe, his eyes white as snow. The blade quivered between them, almost resting on Carol's chest. All Willas had to do was push. Carol slowly reached up to grab the knife, and I knew Willas would do nothing to stop him. I rose, my lungs on fire. I couldn't feel my limbs, but somehow I had to move. I ran and slammed into Carol's back, hugging him to me. There was a sound like a watermelon being squished, and I felt Carol stiffen. There was a pain in my chest. The knife had gone all the way through Carol and cut me as well. It was deep. I bled. I stumbled away from the big man, who turned on me, his own knife sticking out of his chest. How he was still standing, I didn't know. But when he grabbed a hold of the knife and ripped it out of his chest, I screamed. Then he swung around and cut Willas down with a vicious slice. Willas didn't even have time to yell. He only collapsed. Then slowly, sluggishly, Caro stumbled towards me, slashing the bleeding knife in the air. I crawled backwards, but not fast enough. He caught me on the shoulder, on the leg, and again on the chest. I felt my blood flow freely, but did not feel pain. Caro raised the knife high in the air, lost his balance, and toppled over backwards. And then there was silence. It was like the gods had turned the sounds of the world off. I couldn't hear anything. Slowly, I dragged myself to my knees and looked at my would-be killer. He was still alive, his chest a slaughterhouse of flesh and blood. His breathing sounded like the waves of the ocean. He was sure to die, but I could not take that chance. I wrestled the knife from his fingers. Caro tried to resist, but his movements were too sluggish to matter. His eyes widened as I placed the knife to his throat and pushed. It was so much easier than Michael. Only when I was sure he was dead did the sound come back, and it came in a wave. Willas was screaming, his voice cracking, covered in a mix of his blood and Caro's. A deep gash marked him from his shoulder to his hip. I stumbled to his side, not knowing what to do. Was my friend going to die? Was I going to die? These are not questions I was able to answer. What I did know was that dance was due back any minute. We had to move. Using the knife, I tore Caro's shirt off his corpse and wrapped it around Willas, staunching the bleeding. Luckily, the cut wasn't deep. It just bled profusely. And if Willas's screams were any indication, it hurt like hell.
He seemed to be having a fit. I tried to reason with him, tried to get him standing, but he was shaking like an infant. Saliva bubbled up from his mouth, and tears and snot stained his face. It was actually quite gross, I'll admit. Regardless, Willas refused to rise. In frustration, I slapped him across the face, but this did little to help. In fact, he started to struggle with me, his limbs flailing out and catching me in the face. I doubled back, and for one dark moment I considered leaving him in that small room to die. But Willas had saved me. He had brought me on the Queen when I had nowhere else to go. And besides, I didn't think the crew would take me back if Willas was not there to make them. But moving Willas was proving to be impossible. He flailed and screamed and bled, and there was no reasoning with him. If I stayed, it would be simply to join Willas as pig food. Unless... I rushed to my knapsack. I pushed aside the rings, the necklace, the golden flag. I ran back to Willas and placed the Amber Widow around his wrist. The spider's legs closed around him, slowly pushing its teeth into his flesh. Willas let out a final scream, and then went limp. The venom taking hold. He blinked several times, and then slowly, he sat up and stared at me. "We should probably be going," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. I collapsed, the wounds finally taking their toll, the adrenaline falling away. But with the spider powering him, Willas raised me to my feet, and together we stumbled from the room and out into the muddy streets of Lastport. We looked around, and not knowing where to go, we stumbled off into the morning light. The Endless Ocean was written and directed by Keenan Ellis. Ambient sound designed by Sword Coast Soundscapes. Check out our other podcast, The Phone Booth, which explores a world in which 99% of every human being on the planet has a superpower. Also, if you like our shows and want to help us make more, please consider becoming a patron at www.patreon.com/foolsgallery. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week on The Endless Ocean.